Hey everybody, welcome to the Psychology of Games podcast, where we discuss how psychology and video games interact to shape our behavior, our beliefs, and our purchasing intentions. My name is Jamie Madigan, a psychology PhD and a lifelong gamer. I write and podcast about this stuff on psychologyofgames.com, and I'll be your host. User experience, often abbreviated UX, is one of those terms I kept seeing come up in the context of psychology and video games for a long time. I once had a recruiter contact me asking if I was interested in applying for UX position, but she stopped responding to me when I asked, "What is that anyway?" It's probably for the best, and I imagine they found somebody better for the job. Frequently, user experience is a field of study brought up in job postings where a game developer is looking for someone to do research on how players experience a game and play through it. Sometimes it's rolled up with user interface design work, but not always. Sometimes the job posting includes language about playtesting and prototyping, but not always. But a lot of times the job posting will mention that experience or education in psychology, experimental design, and data management are a plus. Still, I never really thought much about it or the world of user experience research other than the fact that it was out there and some people in psychology backgrounds ended up doing it. But keep mentioning something often enough and I'll eventually get curious about it. Earlier this year, I kept seeing UX come up in my social media and web browsing. I see conferences about UX getting tweeted about, LinkedIn groups getting created, and articles being published on blogs. This made me want to learn more. What exactly does a user experience group at a game developer or publisher do? How does it improve games that I play? Or does it? A big part of my job as an industrial organizational psychologist is understanding what people do in their jobs, so I felt I could figure this out with the right kind of help. After some basic reading up about the job, the next step's usually to talk to the subject matter experts about it, preferably somebody who's done the job. So I decided to contact an old friend of mine who spent years working in the UX field, both in the game industry and outside of it, and ask her what it's all about. Funny, I've never asked her before.
Hello.
This is Karen, and she knows a few things about UX.
So my name is Karen Baino, and I'm a principal user experience designer at a company called Luminous Networks. We work in the network space, but I spent a long time in the game industry, about 15 years.
I first met Karen back when she ran an old school website called Planet Quake back in the early 2000s, and she has since gone on to work for other gaming companies.
I previously worked for a company called Z2, which was recently bought by King. We worked on free-to-play mobile games, and prior to that, I've worked for Uber Entertainment, I've worked for Raven Software, I've worked for Activision, I've worked for Gas-Powered Games, and there might be a few others in there I might have forgotten about.
So what do you do as a UX designer?
As a user experience designer, I do a lot of design centered around user interfaces, but that's not really the only thing. It's about defining the kind of experience that we want the user to have with our product. So things like making sure that there's no friction in the interface when they use it. I actually have a really an analogy I tend to use, and that's it's a game analogy. When people are playing a game, I usually say to them, you know those menus you use in the game, and you know how you get those moments where you want to throw your controller at the screen because you have absolutely no idea how to use the menus? My job is to prevent that from happening.
Okay, so that sounds good. I think we could all use fewer broken controllers in our lives, but I'm still not quite sure that I understand exactly what user experience research or UX is about. Like what is it?
So people usually mean a very holistic approach to design. It's kind of a new concept that's sort of popped up in the last few years in the tech industry. And it's not just in the tech industry. I've even talked to people who have done user experience design for like a zoo or a museum. What it means is it's design that's centered around the user. And it's the recognition that the user is a critical component of the design of the product, rather than sort of designing a thing without thinking of the people that are going to use it. We design the product from the user perspective first. And it means that we do a whole series of design steps, hopefully before any engineers actually write any code, that are supposed to solve problems and figure out blockages and bad paths before the engineers actually write that code. We do that through things like prototyping, sketching, and user research. We understand like that, hey, a good user experience means that people kind of fall in love with your product and they'll evangelize it more and they'll tell their friends about it. And sometimes that's a really intangible thing. Like it's kind of like what people talk about when they're the first time they ever used an iPhone, right? That's user experience design. It's like, wow, this just really feels good.
All right, so this was starting to make sense to me. If you acknowledge that people are part of the whole package, part of the whole product that you're trying to design, then your thoughts start to turn to, well, how do we measure what people are doing, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, And this is all familiar territory, and a lot of the tools and experimental procedures that we use in psychology seem like they'd be a good fit. You'd want to be able to survey people, you'd want to be able to observe people and develop tools for rating observed behaviors. You want to have standardized structures for interviewing them and gathering data and formatting data and defining and operationalizing data. So I put this observation to Vainu and asked her what she thought.
All of those are tools that are used in user experience. So you can do surveys of your customers to ask them a lot of questions. That's a nice, valuable, broad scope kind of tool to use. But really the sort of meat of user experience research, it comes in interviewing your customers if you have a chance to do that. Actually physically talking to them face to face, viewing in person playtest sessions where you can actually talk to the player after they've done some playtesting, so you can actually ask them questions.
Okay. This seems like something that a psychologist might be interested in and might be good at. A huge part of psychology is defining and quantifying human behavior and attitudes. It's about measuring things and seeing how they relate empirically to other things. It's about understanding the effects that precede the causes. It's understanding the basic mental processes like perception, attention, information processing, decision-making, and memory. And it's about understanding, measuring, and controlling affective or emotional states like happiness, frustration, anger, confusion, and satisfaction. These are all things that are important to the experience of playing a video game, and they're all things you could find in the subject index of most psychology textbooks. So yeah, I get it now. I get what UX is and how it's related to psychology. Or I think I do. Just to be sure, I decided to interview one other expert for this episode of the podcast. Someone who knows both psychology and user experience research. Celia Hodent is the director of UX for Epic Games. She has a PhD in cognitive psychology and a strong interest in neuroscience, all of which she puts to use in her job. In the interview, we talk more about the user experience field in general, but also how somebody interested in those fields can get into the industry. So stick around for that. All right, so thanks for joining me on this part of the podcast. As I mentioned, my guest this episode is Celia Hodent, PhD. Hey, Celia. You're the director of user experience for Epic Games, makers.
That's right.
Makers of fine products like Unreal Tournament, the Unreal Engine, the forthcoming Fortnite, and others. So thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
So what is it exactly that you do at Epic as the director of UX or user experience research?
Sure. So what I do is I'm building up user experience as a discipline at Epic Games. It's a fairly new discipline in games in general. So I build up a team, build up a UX lab, and I'm building up a strategy that we call the UX strategy to think about, to put the user at the center of what we're doing. So when I say user, it's the gamer or the game developer that was going to be using Unreal Editor. But this is what we're trying to do: be user-centered and always thinking about the experience we're going to offer to our audience.
So what is your day or what does your week look like? What kind of things does a user experience researcher work on?
A lot of things. I can go and discuss with the different teams, the game teams or the engine team, and see where they're at, where there are their challenges, if they have any choices to make, the trade-offs, what it's going to mean for the user. What we also do is a lot of user research. So Brian Oakley on our team is a UX researcher, and he's conducting a lot of research on our development for our games in development and for the engine team.
When you say user research, what does that mean? Are you like running experiments or running sessions? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yes, so we are running experiments, but experiment is a very big word. We're using scientific tools and a scientific approach, but it's really nothing like a science lab. So what we do concretely, for example, if we think about Fortnite, which is a game in development, so it's still very rough, we would bring people, like the target audience, like the people who are interested in playing Fortnite, and we just put them in front of the game and have them just play freely or have them do a specific task in the game, and we observe what's happening. So we observe their interaction with the game so we can actually see all the friction points and measure in the end if the experience that they are experiencing is the same that the experience that designers and the development team in general intended.
So you're measuring experiences and evaluating them and trying to make sure that they link up with what the developer had in mind.
Yeah, we try to measure these things. It's a bit complicated. So user experience in video games has two big buckets. You have the usability part and the game flow part. So the usability part is really all about, like I was saying, the friction points. Like if something is not understandable, if you don't understand how to interact with the interface, or you don't understand what this icon means, or you don't know, you just did something, you didn't have any feedback, so you don't understand what happened, or you don't know what are your objectives. All these things are into the big usability bucket. And this is easier to measure because there's a lot of literature about usability already for web design, for example. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of guidelines that we can follow, and we can just look at how people interact and see what are the problems. So this is easier to measure. But there's another part, because a game can be usable and not fun. Mm-hmm. And fun is a very... Yeah. Fun is a very complicated thing. It's very elusive, and so actually a lot of people are not even talking about fun. They're trying to talk about immersion, for example. And so the way I approach it, I talk about game flow. Genova Chen is also someone who will be talking about the flow in games, and this is harder to measure. So what flow is about the pacing of the game, how you perceive the pacing as a player. Is it challenging enough, or is it too challenging? Things like that. Is it like the learning curve? Is it too steep, or is it a good learning curve? So meaning that you're not, you don't have to learn too many things at the same time. So that's one part of it, the pacing. Another part would be the motivation. Are you motivated into playing the game? Does the game bring you autonomy? Does the game make you feel like you're skillful? Does the game allow you to relate to others? So that's another bucket. The last one would be the emotions. Is the game eliciting a lot of emotions? Do you feel excited when you play the game? And all that kind of thing. So of course, everything is intricated, but this is what we're looking at. And this other bucket, the game flow bucket, is harder to measure, of course, because this is all very subjective, and it depends on a lot of variables and depends on people. So this is harder to measure, but this is what we try to do.
So user experience research has been around for decades at this point, right? You know, it started about the time that computer hardware started to get into the hands of everybody, and there were people that were just, studying human-machine interactions, and I imagine, people that do this in all sorts of different contexts. How is what you do around video games different from those other contexts?
It's not really different. So the concept of user experience has been around. I think it's Donald Norman that started to talk about user experience in the 90s. And you're right, it's coming from the human factor field, it's coming from human computer interaction fields. So it's the same field, except that the product, in that case, the video game, is different. So we look at things in different ways. But there's a lot of things that are completely similar, and actually we're using a lot of similar guidelines that we call heuristics, like what I was saying about talking about usability. Heuristics, we use a lot of the same heuristics in product design or in web design or in game design.
So tell me what a heuristic is, because I'm used to talking about that word in terms of like a mental shortcut that we use to make decisions, and it's usually brought up in the context of like biases and ways that people can go astray, relying on these mental shortcuts. But I get the feeling that it means something maybe related, but also a little bit different in your field.
No, it's a kind of shortcut. But when we talk about usability heuristics, we talk like you can talk about guidelines. Like for example, one of the heuristics is consistency. In your interface, you want something like if you're using an icon, if you use that icon, you want that icon to be meaning the same thing every time. If it's not consistent, then the user can be confused because at some point it was meaning something and now it's meaning something else, so he has to relearn what it means. So this is a heuristic, and you can take that as a guideline. So in your interface, you always want to be consistent. Or you always want to have what we call form follows function. Like for example, if you see an object, it tells you just by its shape, it tells you how to interact with it and what it does. So these are things that you can use.
So you're actually Dr. Hodent, right? You have a PhD.
Call me doctor, please.
That's what I tell everybody as well. The only people I make call me Dr. Madigan are my kids. So
it's awesome.
You have a background in psychology, correct? So
yes.
How does that apply to user experience design? How does that come in handy, and how does your knowledge of psychology tend to guide the work that you do?
Everything about user experience, like we were talking about human factors and human-computer interaction, this psychology has a lot to do in that, and especially cognitive psychology. And for example, we're talking about usability heuristics and usability principles. All these guidelines are coming from our limitations of the brain. So knowing about cognitive psychology, knowing about how the brain works, how the brain learns, knowing about brain limitations in terms of perception, attention, memory, is really what is guiding usability principle. It's coming from these limitations.
Can you give me any examples?
So let me give you an example from each bucket. Like for perception, for example, perception is not a passive window to the world, and it's actually a construction of the brain. I don't know if you remember, we had that Twitter trend about the blue and red dress.
Oh, yeah.
And some people were seeing that dress white and gold. And this is just illustrating the fact that perception is completely subjective, and it's a construction of the brain. In terms of perception, it's not passive. Our knowledge about situations and our knowledge about specific things like video games is really changing the way we perceive things. Like, for example, if you're playing a lot of video games and you see pluses coming out of the screen, and you perceive that as you doing damages to a character in the game, for example. And for someone else, it can just mean plus something, and you don't really know what it means. So your perception is really tied to your knowledge of the world and your knowledge on that specific application or a specific game. So this is really important to understand, because when you're a designer, when you design an icon, to you it can mean something really. It could be crystal clear that this is representing, I don't know, this is representing a bomb, or this is representing a flower, but the way you design it, to someone else can actually see something else. So perception is the first level, and everything, and I'm talking about visual perception, but it's the same thing with audio. So it's not the reality that is important, it's how people are perceiving. So that's the first limitation. What we see is not really what exists. So we have to make sure that the designer and the end user are actually seeing and hearing the same.
So how much does that vary from person to person? How likely are you and I, or what factors might influence whether you and I look at the same thing but perceive something different?
So it's a lot to do with the culture, actually. For example, the shape of a stop sign to us in a Western culture, and all the cultures that are using stop signs the same way we do, we will see the same thing, and we will clearly understand that this is a sign for us to stop. Or green is good, red is bad. That kind of thing is part of the culture, although like red being the color of blood is usually the case for a lot of different people. So it has more to do with culture and where you come from than your gender or where you've been living. So it's more about the same codifications, the cultural references you've been growing into.
Yeah, the one I always think of is the icon for saving a file, which is a little 3.5-inch floppy disk, which, you couldn't find one of those in the wild. I don't even know if you could buy one, but I do know that you probably don't need to.
And that's the reason why we're using stereotypical icons very often. Like even the icon for your phone on your phone is actually looking like an old phone, like a land phone. It's not looking like the phones that we have today, mobile phones. But it's also, I don't know if you heard about that study that we're looking at, I think it was Inuit population, but since they're living in an environment there's a lot of snow, they are actually able to discriminate a lot of different variation of white when we cannot. So when you have the jokes, like when you say that males can see blue when female would see lilac or whatever variation of blue, so there's actually not that much difference in terms of gender that I know of, but it's more a difference in culture. So if you learn how to discriminate between different shades and you've learned how to name them, you can actually perceive them differently.
What about the other buckets?
So that was perception. It's a big one. You have attention as well. So the brain is pretty lousy in terms of attentional resources. I don't know if you've seen that. It's pretty popular, but there's videos on YouTube where you have to count basketball passes, and when you do that, you have a gorilla passing by behind, and since you have to count the white team basketball passes, you're really focused on that, and you don't see the gorilla. This is what we call an intentional blindness, meaning that the brain really focuses on one task. Multitasking is a myth. We can actually go from task to task, but it's very difficult for the brain to analyze everything. We're not a computer, so the brain is really efficient at just like ignoring everything else and just focusing on one thing only. So this is really important, especially in games, because there's a lot of things going on the screen, and usually, depending on what sort of game it is, but if it's an action game, there's a lot of things going on, and you want to make sure that you're not trying to display too much information at the same time, and especially not teach too much things at the same time, because the problem is the player is going to be overwhelmed by everything.
Can you give me a specific example of when you've run into that, where you said, okay, you're asking too much of people's ability to focus their attention, or too much of their attentional resources?
But an example would be in an action game when you have to, kill zombies or whatever. So when you're trying to shoot zombies, it's super intense. You have to focus on your task. You have to aim. You have to pay attention to your health. If at that same moment you display information, tutorial text, or information about something else, about another objective, it's very likely that the player is not going to be able to even see it. And if he or she sees it, they're not going to be able to process it, or it's going to be annoying more than anything else. So sometimes it can be the experience wanted. You have games that it's all about managing your attentional resources. Like, for example, Dino Dash, it's all about trying to do as many things as possible, and this is the challenge of the game.
Sorry, the other example I always like to throw out there is that indie game Papers, Please. Did you ever play that?
I don't think so.
You actually played as like a border checkpoint agent, and you would get like passports, and you'd have to like look at all these documents and photographs, and the rules about what was acceptable documentation and what wasn't changed every day, and it got more complicated. Like, it was an actual game mechanic where you had to actually allocate your attentional resources and learn to pay attention and learn to quickly switch between doing things, all under a constant time pressure. So it was really interesting. It took something that was normally a design obstacle for a game, and it turned it into a mechanic.
Absolutely. And again, user experience is all about making sure that the experience intended is the one felt in the end. So if this is the experience intended, that's totally fine. But if it's not the experience intended, you want to remove all the frictions that are not about that experience. So you want to pay attention. Like the brain, there's just so many things the brain can do. So let's say you have just a few tokens. Your brain can just like give to some tasks. If you're asking for too many tokens from the brain, it's just going to feel overwhelming for the player, and sometimes the player is going to feel frustrated, and it's going to feel that it's all because of the game, and you have that rage quit moment because you don't feel actually in power of what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the attentional bucket. And the last, everything happens in the same time in the brain, so it's not really sequential. But the last bucket I want to talk about is memory. So same thing. We don't have, the brain is not like a computer. We're not recording videos or taking pictures in the brain that we store someplace. We are remembering our reality and our perception of reality. So if you remember when I was talking about perception, it's another layer. So we're not remembering the reality. We're not remembering facts as they happen, but we transform it. And even then, we don't remember very well. And sometimes we can just forget about things. So in games, very frequently at the beginning of the game, you have to remember all of these things, you have to remember the controls, you have to remember the mechanics, you have to remember your objectives, and again, there's just so much that you can remember, and so you want to make sure that it's not too much for the player. You can use contextual tips like on screen to prevent the players from remembering the controls. Like for example, in Fortnite, whenever you're close enough from an object, you see press E to search the object. You don't have to remember there's always the E key you have to press to search. So things like that can help the player not having to remember these things.
Yeah, the example you gave in your last GDC presentation that I thought was a good illustration of this was Assassin's Creed. They would pretty much always have like the 4 face buttons, like what they did, up on the screen the whole time. So
yeah, on the top right on the HUD, you always have the contextual controls of the game, so you always know wherever you are in the game what you can do and what buttons you need to press, and you don't even have to remember where. So on the controller, you don't even have to remember what button it is because it's displayed with the in the shape of the controller. So you just have to mimic. That's the button on the down button. You don't have to remember that it's the X button, for example, on PS4. So yeah, these are things. It's always when we talk about that, people don't necessarily realize it, but our brains are pretty lousy at all these tasks. And what we want to do is make sure that we remove all this friction to concentrate on the challenges of the game, so we can actually put the challenge and the wanted frictions where we want, and not in the menus or not in figuring out something that the player should not have to figure out.
In my experience, game designers are pretty smart people. They know about this stuff or they pay attention to what works. Do you get a lot of them that just kind of look at this and say, well, duh, or like, I knew that. Why? What are you doing here? And just let me do my job.
Yes. So
not to put too fine a point on it.
Of course. Well, first of all, we have a lot of biases in the brain, and one of cognitive biases is called the hindsight bias. It's actually way easier to say, yeah, I knew that once it's a fact that we have data of. So it's always easier to know after the fact. So there's one thing. The other thing is a lot of game designers have been doing that for a lot of time. So yes, they have a good background and they know what's going to work and what's not going to work. But it's actually funny because there's a lot of misconception about UX. And one of the misconceptions is that UX is common sense. So yes, sometimes it is going to be common sense. If the icon is not understandable, well, you know what, people are not going to understand it. So there's one thing, but there's a lot of things that actually are not common sense because like I was saying earlier, your perception as a designer is not necessarily going to be the same one as your audience, especially if you're designing for an audience that is very different from who you are. And the other problem is what we call the curse of knowledge. And when you know, it's the same thing. It's your perception. You, as the designer of a game that you know like the back of your hand, you know everything about it. Well, of course you're gonna understand everything about it way faster than someone is just discovering the game, and that's the reason why we are conducting UX research and usability research to see how people first encountering the game or first encountering the interface are actually reacting, because to you, you know about it. It's super easy. It's just like when you're in a city that you know very well, if it's your home and someone is asking you for direction, well, it's super easy for you. So yeah, like you look straight and then first on the right and then second on the left. To you, you have a mental model that is way more precise. That mental model of someone is just coming here, arriving here, who don't necessarily have all the same references that you have in your brain. So this is where it's not common sense anymore, because you have that curse of knowledge. You know the game too well, and you're a game designer, so you know everything about game mechanics. When you play a game, you think about all these things. There's a lot of game designers who say that game developers overall who say, well, now I don't play the games the same way I used to because I analyze the games. And it's very different from a player who's just like here to have fun, and that player is not gonna have the same experience, is not coming with the same mental model than the designer.
Yeah, there's lots and lots of research around the different ways that we can get tripped up on understanding how the way we perceive something is different from the way that other people perceive something. Even something like the fundamental attribution error, where we see somebody do something and we automatically assume that they're doing it because of like internal motivators, internal reasons, like, oh, they're dumb or they're inexperienced, where it actually might have been because something external, like you were putting too many demands on their mental resources, or the control scheme was not working as intended, or the sensitivity on the joypad was off, or something like that.
Yeah, and I would say it's a human curse that like everything that goes wrong in our world, in the human world, is because of that, because we don't have the same perception about things. This is the reason why I can hurt you by saying something when I think is funny, but you actually don't find it funny because you have a specific reference to what I'm saying that is actually hurting you. This is the reason why we have racism. But all the problems in our world are due to that, our different perception, our different reference, and different mental models.
Part of your role as a user experience researcher is to put people through, I guess, playtesting or observe them playing the game so that you can understand how they're perceiving the game and what mental models they're using?
Yes, absolutely. So user research is a big part of UX. We would bring players, and we can have them actually just look at prototypes. So looking at paper prototypes, sometimes we just test icons, and if the icons are intuitive just out of context, or it can be just playing a small part of the game, or it can be playing a huge chunk of the game and see how our players are experiencing the game on the long run. So we don't do the same test depending on at what stage development stage we're at, and depending on what particular questions the designers have. So we have various tests at various moments for a particular game.
And how much does the knowledge and the experience that you gained as a psychologist in terms of like how to design experiments and how to design measures and tools, like how much does that come into play when you're doing this?
It's very important actually to keep in mind cognitive biases, and especially your own biases, because even if when you're a scientist, actually there's a lot of cases right now that have been uncovered, but you can bias people into what you want them to experience just by the way you set up the experiments. So it's actually pretty complex to do that. And even if you don't have a fancy lab, even if you don't have psychologists, anybody can try to do it. But the most important thing is to try to be as unbiased as possible. Make sure that you don't ask the question that's actually inferring a certain answer. Make sure that people are not able to see each other's screens so they can actually see a specific behavior that they're like, oh, I guess I could do that myself. Because people learn a lot by observation and by imitation. So you want to make sure that every individual is experiencing the game in their own way. So it's pretty complicated to have an experiment that is not biased. I'm not entirely sure the experiments we're conducting is not biased 100%. But this is what we're trying to do: limit the biases. And you know what? Even just bringing people the Epic Games facility is inducing a bias. So you can't win. It's actually pretty difficult, but you're trying to limit that a maximum and trying to make sure that what you're observing is really what you're measuring. And we can use multiple tools. Like observation is going to be the biggest tool. Like you put someone in front of the computer and then just let them be, or ask them to do a task and just observe what they're doing. You can also do what we call a think aloud protocol. So you can ask the people to think through the task, which is quite interesting because you can actually understand better what they're thinking about and what they expect the system to do. But it's inducing a bias because people usually are not that thorough when you do something. For example, if you go on a website, you have just a few seconds of attention to that website. You're not looking thoroughly at that website. You're not thinking through, thinking aloud or what you're doing. So even doing that is inducing a bias. We can also use tools like eye tracking tools to actually look at where people gaze. It's actually pretty useful because we can actually see what they're looking at, which is not actually telling what they're perceiving or what they are processing, because you can gaze at some point but not really pay attention to it. So these are all just tools that help us understand better what's going on. But in the end, you're making assumptions, and you have to use multiple data points to actually figure out what's going on. And there are things that are pretty straightforward. That's usually the reason why the guidelines is pretty important. Usability guidelines. It's actually helping, like, removing all the very obvious friction points. And then you have like a fuzzy area where you're trying to figure out what's going on and how you can help player to get to the fun part and not get stuck into a state that you don't want the players to get stuck at.
It seems like somebody with a psychology degree or even a background in any social sciences, sociology, economics, or anything like that, part of it is having the content knowledge, such as everything that you were talking about earlier, but the other part is how do you make sure that you're a good consumer of research, and how do you know how to set up good research and design survey items that are clean and only measure one concept and get at the different facets of the concept, and how do you look at things like inter-rater agreement when people are doing those observational techniques and trying to understand what a person is doing or feeling or thinking. And so I imagine a lot of that training comes in handy, more so than somebody simply doing straight up playtesting and just saying, wow, what'd you think?
Yeah, exactly. The methodology is really important because, again, there's a lot of biases, and you have the hindsight bias even as an experimenter. So you expect things to go wrong in a certain way because you've seen it before, or because you didn't understand it yourself. Same thing, you can, as soon as you see it, you're like, yeah, check, I saw it. Instead of actually looking at everybody, if it's really something that's happened throughout multiple participants, or is it just like an artifact? So it's actually pretty tricky. And same thing for designers. When they come over and watch what's happening, they can also be under that problems, like all these biases. They can look at the task differently. That's why I always tell them it's super important to be there and watch the task, because they can be they need to feel that empathy. They need to feel the suffering of the players, because they don't necessarily realize how difficult and how frustrating sometimes the game can be. But they also need to wait until the complete analysis to not draw conclusions too fast.
Any other thoughts on how psychology can inform UX design or UX research?
I guess it can be super handy as well when you have to communicate about the results.
Oh, yeah.
It's very hard for someone, put his heart and soul into a game, and it's a long process to actually see that players don't understand it or don't like it or didn't get that thing that is actually a pretty cool mechanic in the game, and they don't get it. So it can be very hard to always have to, shift your thinking and shift your plans to react to what the player is actually doing. So as a UX person, especially a user researcher, you have to make sure you communicate well with the designers. You're not here to again, you're not here to, one, give an opinion, because we're not here to give opinions. We're here to try to find out facts on what was going on. Sometimes we make educated guess, for sure, but we always try to stay away from opinions. We're not here to say, hey, I love that game and I prefer that thing to be blue because I don't like red and I prefer it to be blue. You would say it would better for it to be blue because red is usually a color you use for threat, and if you use red, it can be misleading. So we try to stay away from opinions, and we try to give indications on what could be better. And we always try also to make sure we understand all the suffering for them and put ourselves in their shoes, because sometimes it means they're going to have to redo a lot of work because it's not working as expected. So communicating the result is actually half of the work, and it's really important to work hand in hand with the developers and not be someone like a team that is completely separated and just like hand over the report like a hammer and like, hey, take that, developers. You need to redo everything. It's not working. So yeah, it's
basic consulting skills. It sounds like, being
absolutely
able to work with people and influence them, but also realize that you're not necessarily running the show yourself. How is your group sort of received there at Epic? It sounds like you're building, or are you pretty much settled in, and how are you fitting in with the development process?
We're still growing. I've been working here for 2 years now. When I arrived here, UX was very new at Epic, and now we have a whole team with a UX researcher, with a UX designer that is actually assigned on the team, Laura Teebles. She's actually helping whenever the different teams need to prototype something and they don't have the time, or they don't necessarily know how to do it. She would help prototyping some designs so we can actually test it. We have UX project manager, Paul Heath, who's actually helping setting up all the tests and finding the participants. And we have 3 UX lab analysts who are actually observing all the participants, coding the behavior, and helping, like, looking at all the data. And I'm here to coordinate everything, to talk with the team, back to the team, and make sure like we can follow up on the issues and make sure we can support the teams where they need it, and where like Epic as a whole need the support. So now it's growing, and we always try to be there to grow with the other teams. And again, like I was saying, not be a separate team. So we have that going on. It's not always easy. It's a difficult, like making games is very difficult, and creating an editor is more difficult. So it's hard for everyone. Sometimes, like, it is what it is. Sometimes we're running out of time. So even though we know that making tests will actually make us save time in the end, sometimes it's so hectic that we cannot even go through that mental process. So we're trying our best to work hand in hand with the different teams.
So one question I get a lot, people email me or tweet at me or whatever, is, I'm like a college student and I love video games and I like this psychology thing, or I want to get into the gaming industry.
Mm-hmm. Get that a lot too.
So what's your advice to those people, especially the ones who might be interested in coming into the gaming industry from a UX angle? Like, what should they study? What should they get involved with before they graduate? What should they have on their resume once they do go job hunting?
So anything that's related to human factors, human-computer interaction, cognitive psychology, experimental psychology, all these things are super useful. You need to understand games if you want to work in a video game industry. So that it doesn't mean just playing games, but understand a little bit about game design, understand what it means, what level design was, what a UI artist is doing, what are game mechanics. So you can actually have the same vocabulary than the game team. So that's really important. Be curious. You're not going to be working just on one type of game, so you have to be curious and play a lot of different games. So that's the second thing. And now there's a lot of UX labs and user research labs that are popping here and there. A lot of game companies now have their own, and they usually have a lot of interns there, or they hire sometimes very junior profiles, because we need a lot of people now doing that. So that could be a way of getting in there, like being really like follow people on Twitter, or looking at like on LinkedIn, you have a lot of groups around UX and usability. So follow all these people and look at whenever there's an opportunity, like be here on time, be the first, and yeah, have your background and human factor psychology, whatever, or even neuroscience is getting super trendy now. Again, be curious. Now with the internet, it's like it's easier. You can talk to people. You can get involved into groups. You can get involved into discussions on Reddit or whatever, on Facebook or Twitter. You can follow people. You can create a blog and talk about all these things. So the more curious you are, and the more willing to interact with people, and passionate you are, and try to get out there and to do stuff yourself, the more you're going to get noticed, and the easier it's going to be for you.
Yeah, that seems to be the common advice. If you want to work in the game industry, make a game, or make a mod.
Oh, yeah.
Do something along those lines. Make a map,
It's harder for a UX researcher, because I don't know how to make a game. But it's a little bit different. So if you know how to program a little bit, or if you have any of these skills, yeah, for sure, making a game is going to be interesting. But our strength when you're working UX is actually not to be too much in there, so you can actually have the perspective of the player, not just the perspective of the developer. So it's more about being curious, about reading articles, about being on top of what's going on with biometrics and stuff like that, and start, an internship. And a lot of places now are doing user research.
Okay, cool. Well, a lot of great information I think we've gotten here, so I appreciate it. But a couple of questions to kind of wrap things up. What have you been playing lately?
I've been playing a lot of Fortnite lately.
I thought you might say that.
Yeah. We're doing our third online test, so I've been playing a lot of Fortnite.
So what is Fortnite? I only have it's kind of base building, and it's kind of a shooter.
It's an action building game. So you shoot zombies like with all husks, but you're also building your base. And the more buildings you have, the more buffs or the more heroes you can actually send into mission. And whenever you get into mission, you have actually to build your fort and protect your fort from the zombies. So you have the action part when you have to protect and shoot, and you have the building part. You have to gather resources and build your fort to protect whatever you have to protect from the zombies. Okay. Yeah, well, I really hope it's going to offer a great experience to the players out there. We're certainly working hard for that.
Very deliberate choice of words on your part there.
You see where I'm going, right?
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah, sure. I've been playing. I usually play a lot of games that are just out there just to try them out. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to finish them all, so I've been playing Batman, and trying out Fallout Shelter. So pretty much any games are coming out, I'll play a little bit and try it out on any platforms. So I can actually keep up to date and see if there's any cool thing about interface that is new, or a new sort of emotions that are created for the player, or anything new that's really interesting for me to look at.
Yeah, I played Fallout Shelter for a while too when it first came out, and got pretty heavy into it, and was pretty obsessive about checking my resources and getting my dwellers out into the wasteland and back. And at one point, though, the game started crashing. I couldn't even load my save game up. It would just crash to desktop of the iPad, and I kind of realized how relieved I was, though, when that happened, that I could just set it down, because I'd figured the game out. I knew how to win. Getting to the population cap was just going to be a matter of putting enough time into it.
Sorry, that's actually a good segue about the experience. When you talk about user experience, it's everything about the game and beyond the game. So downloading the game, if the game is crashing at some point, there's long loading time. All these things that is typically not the game, but it is part of the experience, and you can't just like get frustrated about the game and stop playing because of these things. So this is also something to take into account. It's really important.
So it's the whole process of installing and starting.
Yes, everything, the website, the forums, when you download the game, the loading times, everything.
That's interesting.
Everything is part of the
I didn't even think of that user experience would extend to all of those corners, but I guess it should and does.
Yeah, like in product design, like unwrapping the box is part of the experience. Some products are more compelling to open than others.
It's okay. You can say Apple. I know that you're thinking Apple.
Okay, like when you open box from Apple, like this whole thing is part of the experience. You're super excited. It looks super neat, and the box is beautiful. So even that is part of the experience.
Yeah, and my favorite part is always peeling off the little clear sticker, like the screen protector. That always just feels great to peel that off of whatever screen.
Okay, how many devices have you bought to get that experience over and over again?
I just keep returning them and exchanging them for new ones.
I see. Maybe we should do a peeling game.
That's true. It's sort of the bubble wrap effect.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so great. So if somebody wanted to find out more about you and the work you do on the internet, where would they go?
I'm on Twitter at Celia Hodent. I'm on LinkedIn. I have a blog, celiahodent.com, that I need to find more time to complete. But I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. Twitter is the easiest way for me.
Yeah, you seem pretty active on Twitter.
Yes, I love Twitter. Because of my short attention span, only 140 characters. It's perfect for me.
It's a perfect experience. That's right.
Perfect for a lot of brains, actually.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your time. It's super interesting stuff.
Thank you so much for inviting me and let me talk about these things. I can always talk forever about the brain in video games.
Yeah.
So.
Well, maybe we'll have another chance in the future.
All right. Well, thank you again,
All
Jamie.
right, thanks. Congratulations on reaching the end of yet another Psychology of Games podcast. Remember that you can, at any time, go to psychologyofgames.com. There you'll find hundreds of articles and all the other podcast episodes. You'll also find links for following me on Twitter, Facebook, or RSS. And you'll also find information on how to contact me, support me on Patreon, etc. Finally, there's information on how to subscribe to the podcast and how to rate and review it on iTunes. That's always very much appreciated. So thanks again, and I'll see you next episode.